the Speaker, I can tell you that both initiatives will deliver more than what that last government attempted to when, for instance, they put out a $1 billion infrastructure scheme.
Tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to this week's A View from Afar. And today we are joined again by political scientist Paul Buchanan, and we will discuss how Taiwan is delicately navigating its way between two clashing global powers. Taiwan has been self-governing for over 70 years. It insists it wants to remain an independently governed economy. But recently, the People's Republic of China's leader, Xi Jinping, stated China wishes to unify Taiwan and assert control over the Southeast Asian nation. And on the other hand, the United States of America has renewed its defence commitment to Taiwan, and we'll discuss that in more depth as to what that really means. The Pentagon this week, for example, said the United States commitment to Taiwan is rock solid. And in recent weeks, it's been reported that United States military have been present in part on Taiwanese soil. But how committed is the United States really? Will the US come to Taiwan's defence should China invade it? And what would China gain strategically if it did invade? And what would China lose if a regional conflict occurred? Taiwan's leader said this week that it will not submit to China's will on this issue of its independence. But rather, she said, it will use diplomacy to find a way through. That is, unless China did invade. So what is the most likely outcome of this situation? And how can China back off, save face, and get back to the business of economic mutual interest? Before we deep dive into this issue, do remember, if you are joining us live, we can include your comments into this program. Okay, so let's cross to Paul, who is waiting online and ready to unpack the complexity of this issue for us. Good afternoon, Paul.
Kia ora, Selwyn, and good afternoon on a beautiful sunny day on the west flank of the Waitakere Ranges.
It's a perfect spring day, isn't it?
It's a good day to be alive, I must say.
That's what I thought this morning. And of course, for those that are coming to us from further afield, we're coming to you from Auckland City. Paul is in the rural belt of that, and Auckland region is in level 3 lockdown, along with the Waikato region to our south and the Northland region to our north. And level 3 lockdown is quite strict, and we're all getting a little bit tired of it, but we know it's a good thing. So if New Zealanders are watching, get vaccinated, please, as soon as you can. Paul, back to the topic of our week here, Taiwan. Paul, what are the most main issues in brief in the first instance that you are picking up from this Taiwan thing, and then we'll deep dive into it?
Yeah, well, it seems to me that hawks on all sides are beating the drums of war, both on the Chinese side and certainly on the Western side. The US and Australia in particular are really drumming up the possibility of war with the specter of a full-on invasion of Taiwan by the Chinese. And I'm not so sure that that is going to happen, that cooler heads in the capitals involved will refrain from these sort of, apocalyptic scenarios. But I thought what we do, Selwyn, if you don't mind, is let's talk about some of the political motivations that may bring these countries to, at least to the brink of war. And then later on, we can unpack the actual military strategies that might be invoked. But if you're willing to indulge me for a second, I'll do that as quickly as possible.
No, that's great, Paul. That's really informative, and it lays a good bedrock. So let's do that right now.
All right. So, here's the deal. I'll start with the Chinese perspective. Obviously enough, with the announcement of AUKUS, that's the Australian, US, UK nuclear technology transfer deal that involves submarines, with the creation of the so-called Quad, Japan, India, Australia, and the United States. These are all containment vehicles, against the Chinese. And they're going to come online within the next 10 years. The first of those boats that'll be built for the Australians should probably come online around 2030. So the Chinese have a time window in which they can do one of two things. They can either accept the fact that the status quo is going to change against them, and they will be more limited in their ability to power project throughout East Asia, Southeast Asia, and beyond, or they can make their move over the short term and establish a fait accompli, an accomplished fact of a status quo that they control, particularly in the South China Sea and inside the so-called First Island chain, which extends from Japan down through the Philippines and Borneo into, pretty much ends about there. And then we get into the second island chain a little further to the east. The point is this: if the Chinese are going to prevent being encircled and contained, particularly as a naval power, they got to make their move sooner rather than later. Because right now, they're in a pretty good position, militarily speaking, when it comes to the regional balance of power. Within 10 years, their position will have been reduced. So obviously, the hawks and the Chinese military are urging the leadership of the Communist Party to think seriously about making a move and consolidate the gains of the island building project, gain control of the various straits that connect the Pacific with the South China Sea and then out to the Malaccan Straits, and see what the West does. And so there's military reasons, geostrategic reasons, and then there's internal political reasons. Things in China are not well, and we'll come back to this in a few minutes. As it turns out, there's been some miscalculations in China about supply chain bottlenecks, things that are in the news in the West today. And some of the viewers may not know this, but China's been beset by rolling power outages and industrial shutdowns because they lack in coal. They don't have enough coal to fire their power plants. And so some of their major industrial cities are shutting down 2 or 3 times a week in order to preserve what energy is there, and they have these rolling blackouts. Now, the people who must be laughing all the way to the bank are the Australians, who are the biggest suppliers of coal to China, and they've been taking it in shorts.
So just in brief, Paul, has China been transitioning at this stage, like a lot of countries, to more sustainable kind of natural energy systems, or is it just simply that it's been caught out from the point of view of getting tough on its main provider of coal and it's been found wanting?
They've been caught out. I mean, they were going to transition to sustainable energy, and they always talk a good talk about that. But if you look, for example, at the COP21 meetings that are going on in Glasgow today, the Chinese are not present. You know, they didn't send a high-level delegation. They're not participating even by video. And it turns out it's because China now is the biggest consumer of coal in particular, fossil fuels, but coal in particular, and they're dragging their heels on moving to sustainable energy because of one fact: they are willing to pay a higher price for coal than the global mean or the global average. But even so, it's a combination of internal supply and external imports, and it's the internal side where the Chinese have found these bottlenecks and what have you. So they're not meeting the demand for coal in their energy sector. And that,
so what alternatives does it have outside of Australia to actually supply its coal-powered energy generation? Because that's significant to its internal pressures, isn't it, of growth in particular?
Well, exactly. I mean, they are pushing through the Belt and Road Initiative. They are trying to open up coal markets in places like Argentina, which has ample coal reserves, but the Argentines are more environmentally friendly at this stage of their development and are a little reluctant to get back into heavy coal mining, of the coal mining business. They're looking to Africa. But all of these things take time to come online, even if they were to. And the problem is political. There's already been demonstrations in cities, peaceful, not of long duration, but you're now getting the population, that rising middle class population in China, are starting to get a little restive, because if you have, again, it's like Iraq, half the day the power's out. 3 days a week, no one goes to work because there's no energy. Those are problems for the Communist Party, serious problems, and in particular problems for President Xi. So what do authoritarians do when they get squeezed? Well, they try to divert into some nationalistic venture. And so it would suit President Xi and the CCP to stir up things in their near abroad and divert the gaze of the Chinese polity towards, nationalistic symbols such as recovering Taiwan. And so the Chinese have an imperative, I believe. Other strategists may not think so, but I believe that they have an imperative to move sooner rather than later to consolidate the gains that they have made in the East and South China Seas. At the same time and simultaneously, they can appease or placate somewhat rising domestic discontent about the mishandling of the energy situation. Now, let's think about the United States, because this is key to any discussion of Taiwan.
Yep.
The United States has a bilateral security agreement with Taiwan. You mentioned it at the onset of the show. It is not an ironclad security guarantee. I went and reread it this past week, and it turns out the United States has not committed itself to the physical defense of Taiwan. Think of, for example, of NATO, and attack on one member was to be considered an attack on all. That's not the case with Taiwan. The U.S. is committed to arming Taiwan, but the term they use is defending.
Yeah, well, on this point, before we dig into that, let's hear what the Pentagon said in its stand-up press conference on exactly this issue this week, Paul. It runs for about 1 minute 30, and
the PRC has stepped up efforts to intimidate and pressure Taiwan and other allies and partners, including increasing their military activities conducted in the vicinity of Taiwan, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea, which we believe are destabilizing and only increase the risk of miscalculation. Our support for and defense relationship with Taiwan remains aligned against the current threat posed by the People's Republic of China, and we urge Beijing to honor its commitment to the peaceful resolution of cross-strait differences as delineated in the three communiques. We act in accordance with the One China policy, and we've long abided by that policy, and it's distinct from Beijing's One China principle, under which the Chinese Communist Party asserts sovereignty over Taiwan. We take no position over the sovereignty of Taiwan, on sovereignty over Taiwan. We will continue to support a peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues consistent with the wishes and best interests of the people of Taiwan. And our commitment to Taiwan is rock solid and contributes to the maintenance of peace and stability across the strait and within the region. We do remain concerned by the PRC's provocative military activity near Taiwan.
So there you go, Paul. That's a very recent briefing from the Pentagon on this issue. Can you make sense of that for us in the audience, please?
It was quite a bit of a word salad towards the end there. Kirby was obviously in a bad position, because once he admitted that the United States recognizes the One China policy, then the claims to Taiwanese independence go out the window.
Yeah.
That's part of the reason why the security guarantee is not ironclad. And this poses a problem, because the Taiwanese are well aware that if the Chinese were to make a serious move on them, they can't be guaranteed that the United States will come to their rescue. And certainly no other countries will come if the United States doesn't come. And that involves far-off places like New Zealand, which otherwise would more than likely join a Western alliance. But Taiwan's in a bit of a predicament. Now, let me just stop for a second, because I know that there's a lot of people who believe that, well, Taiwan was always part of China, and this is a rogue or a renegade government that has been on the island for 70 years. Now, let me just clarify this. The current regime in what it used to be known as Formosa, the island of Formosa, were the losers in the Chinese Civil War that culminated the Long March. Mao Zedong's troops defeated those of the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek. He was backed by the West and had been instrumental in the fight against the Japanese. And Chiang Kai-shek and his troops, leading a movement called the Kuomintang, retreated onto the island of Formosa in defeat in 1949. They are not native to Formosa. Formosa, it turns out, have indigenous people known as Formosans who are not, if you think of ethnicity, they're a mix of Polynesian and Asian. They're not Han Chinese. They're a different race. And those people were suppressed, oppressed, and squashed by Chiang Kai-shek, who was not a nice guy. But the KMT regime, since 1949, has liberalized and liberalized and liberalized to the point that Taiwan today is the leading liberal democracy in all of Asia. It beats Japan, it beats South Korea, it certainly beats India when it comes to liberal democratic values, when it comes to institutional integrity, when it comes to the autonomy of the judiciary. Taiwan is a stellar example of Asian democracy. And when you think of what happened to the other example of Asian democracy, Hong Kong, that also had Chinese claims on it within the last couple of years, the Taiwanese have reason to believe that the one nation, two style of government approach that was used on Hong Kong will wind up to their detriment if the Chinese invoke that same sort of principle on the island itself. So we have a problem here because the Taiwanese are not just the remnants of the Kuomintang regime and now their generational successors. There are indigenous people who have never had a say in their governance, although they're happy with their lot, more or less now. And we have a former superpower, the United States, which used to be able to offer security guarantees, and that would be enough to deter other countries. They wouldn't try to, challenge the United States or call their bluff. But now we have a much diminished United States. United States was seriously hurt by the Trump years. If the Chinese are going to make a move, the United States right now is in disarray. Joe Biden's presidency is not going well at all, through faults of his own and then faults of his opposition. But the United States is in internal disarray. It's in military retreat around the world, and one could argue that that's not necessarily a bad thing. But if you're going to test the American metal in a far-off place where you have the strategic advantage, at least momentarily, the time is now for the Chinese.
But it didn't work well for imperialistic Japan all of those years ago with respect to Pearl Harbor, did it? And there's that famous kind of quote that came from the emperor on such things. But it's complex too, and I'll just briefly put maybe just sew in a little bit of context here too. Paul, you'll be able to talk to this with absolute authority, but in general terms here, even in the Pacific region, we can see China's, those countries that support China in the multilateral bodies like the United Nations, et cetera, about its stated belief in its one nation policy and its stated claim to Taiwan. And you can see this is separated in this map here that we're looking at by those countries that recognise the People's Republic of China and those with respect to Taiwan that recognise Taiwan, the Republic of China. And that's what you were talking about in specific terms just there. So there's some interesting things if you look at this map from the point of view of what countries actually acknowledge and fall in behind, and you'll be able to see put a context as to does it really mean anything. But in the multilateral context, you see countries like New Zealand and Australia that actually support the one nation policy. We saw the spokesperson from the Pentagon make reference to the United States in support of that type of thing. You've got countries around the northern West Pacific, for example, Papua New Guinea, that does. We've got Vanuatu, we've got Fiji, Tonga, Niue, Cook Islands, and Samoa. And then you've got countries that are, Taiwan itself has actually pulled on side, so that if it came to a thing relating to the sovereign claim or the legal claim to its territories, that these countries would back it. And there's Solomon Islands, Nauru, Marshall Islands, which is very close to the United States' interests in many respects, Kiribati, Tuvalu, et cetera, and on it goes. So there is a real divide due to, some would argue, checkbook diplomacy, and others would say that, that this goes back to a historical kind of positions of what you were talking about, Paul. So with that having been said, how do you see any particular kind of conflict, whether it be militarily or whether it be trade or even a clash of diplomacies, how do you see these countries actually falling in behind Taiwan or accentuating its commitment to China's right to one nation policy, or Taiwan doesn't fall into that? Is that where the complexity is?
Well, to say the least, it's complex. We've got to go back a little bit in time, because until the U.S. opening to China in 1973, the vast majority of the world, and certainly of the Pacific on that map you just showed, recognized the Republic of China seated in Taiwan as the legitimate Chinese government, and did not recognize the communist government on the mainland. And this was a product of the Cold War era. So, the Russians recognized China, Cuba recognized China, but the vast majority of the West, with the exception New Zealand recognized China very early on, but the vast majority of the West recognized the Republic of China, the Kuomintang regime, as the legitimate government. Remember, this was a civil war that went poorly for the KMT, as they're known. But this had nothing to do with Taiwan per se. What happens? The United States decides that it will recognize China, accept the one China policy, and then you start seeing shifts in the disposition of other Western governments. China, meanwhile, builds itself into the power that it is today, and starting in the 90s, it engages in this, you mentioned it, checkbook diplomacy, where it offers developmental assistance in exchange for recognition. And with recognition then come votes in multilateral institutions in favor of Chinese positions. And who are susceptible to that cash book diplomacy type of thing? Small island countries. Absolutely. They're cash strapped. They're underdeveloped. The Chinese come in and are willing to do a lot for them. So that blue and red dotted map that you see, the blue are the remnants of the former universal Western coalition that recognized the Republic of China. The red are the countries that over the last 20 to 30 years have come to recognize the People's Republic, and they're the recipients of a lot of that cash book diplomacy. Now, the long-term play is this, Selwyn, and this is the sinister side to it. If the People's Republic of China can eliminate, via its cash book diplomacy or otherwise, all recognition of the Republic of China as a sovereign state, turn those blue dots to red, and get other countries, I think there's only one or two left in the world that recognize the Republic of China. If you can get the world bodies to no longer recognize that Taiwan is a sovereign state, then they can make a physical play. Because what the world is telling them is, yes, it is a province. It is yours. And if they decide to make it a play, make it an armed play on Taiwan, that becomes a matter of internal politics. It no longer becomes an international concern. So
and of course,
part of the move to try to push out the Taiwanese from international fora, beyond the short-term benefits of getting votes in favor of various Chinese positions, is that once you've removed them entirely as recognized sovereign actors, then you can move on them militarily, and the chances of anyone coming to their rescue will be remote at best.
But significantly too, Taiwan as an independent governing economy is very much most significant in the region and the world from the point of view of manufacturing high-tech goods and even services, but mostly in the manufacture of goods, isn't it? The silicon chips that we all enjoy in all of the West's equipment, the sophistications of the technology that China relies on for satisfying the wants and needs of its various classes and also going forward into the future. It's reliant on that expertise and intellectual property that is developed, if you like to put it in such terms, in Taiwan. If you look at camera gear, that is designed and engineered in Japan, Nikon, for example, though that equipment, the sophistications as Nikon positions to front foot it with the likes of Canon and Sony, all the detail, the equipment, the chips, the hardware parts of those cameras, the lenses, all manufactured in Taiwan. Once again, China's interests in Taiwan are twofold, aren't they? Like what we've determined here and what we've discussed here, but also there's a codependency that's there. Taiwan's biggest trading partner remains China. China, and it's significant from the point of view of its own want and growth, needs Taiwan. It comes down to, I suppose, in some ways, can China actually get what it wants, control and secure up its two-way trade with Taiwan without interference, irrespective of who is backing Taiwan, and get back to the business of economic development and growth? Or, Paul, do you feel that has reached a tipping point and military intervention or the hard edge of diplomacy at the very least is going to be the realities for the next 12 months or even 2 years?
We may see we will see some of this continue for a while, but your points are very well taken, and taken in the sense that they mitigate against any rash Chinese move. The fact of the matter is that these displays of military might, to include a large-scale amphibious assault exercise conducted by the Chinese across the strait from Taiwan just last week, are all intended mainly for one audience, and that's the domestic audience in China. Sure, we take note of it. We take note of the multiple forays by Chinese aircraft into the Taiwanese military identification zone, which, by the way, is not the same as its territorial airspace. Military identification zones, because the military likes to keep its threats far away, extend hundreds of miles away from the coast of, let's say in this instance, Taiwan. In fact, the Taiwanese military identification zone extends onto the mainland. And so it's not synonymous with Chinese aircraft flying over, Taipei. Nothing of the sort. But they are signaling that they can mass air power, and that air power, if you look, a lot of those are bombers. So they're signaling that, we can bomb you, we can do these sort of things. But I would argue that the main signaling is to the domestic audience that Xi Jinping has to worry about, given the problems at home. Now, you just said it. Taiwan is an economic prize, and perhaps the Chinese would like to gain control, direct control, over that prize. But there are several problems with that. To begin with, this is a country, again, Taiwan, that now has several generations of people, skilled labor in particular, who have been brought up under liberal democratic rule, even more so than the younger generations in Hong Kong. They are not going to be an easy crowd to suppress. They're used to press freedom. Again, it's a liberal democracy, full-throated. And so even if the Chinese were to take the place peacefully without a fight, which would not happen, and I'm about to mention that, then you've got a restive population, which, among other things, can refuse to work. And you don't have the labor to replace them, at least not immediately. So given the current arrangements, and as you said, Taiwan's greatest trading partner, including in computer chips and the like, is the People's Republic. And so why would you upset that apple cart in order to make a claim on territory that you otherwise do not need? Now let's get to the heart of the military matter so people understand this is not an easy, slam dunk for the Chinese. They're many island countries. I used to deal with one known as Cuba back in the day. They have versions of what are known as the hedgehog strategy. In fact, another country I lived in, Singapore, has a version of that. And what the hedgehog strategy basically means is that you're an island state. You're confronted by a much bigger invading force. So what you do is you dig down, you hunker down, you go underground, and you make it incredibly costly for the invading force to not only take over physically, but to pacify the country in their preferred image. Then when they do that, when they finally get control of the major urban centers, and that's going to take some time, then you engage in protracted guerrilla war. Those American forces that are in Taiwan now, guess what? They're special forces. What do special forces guys do? Oh, they do guerrilla warfare. That's what they're supposed to be doing, not what the stuff they were doing in Afghanistan and Iraq. So their stock in trade is guerrilla warfare. So the Chinese need to understand, yeah, I guess you could bomb them, but they're just going to go underground. Then you're going to invade them, and you're going to get a lot of people shot trying to dig out Taiwanese from their tunnels. You can be assured that that island is laced with tunnels with weapons in them. I can guarantee you that. Again, haven't been a student of island military strategies. So the
cost? Yeah, what would China do? How would it weigh up the costs, the benefits? We know China from history likes to. It'll certainly defend what it perceives as its mainland, and if it perceives this, then it would defend its right to actually occupy in one way or form. But we also know that China, going back many decades now, wants to get back to business. It wants to satisfy the demands and wants of its own populations. So where are we on this, Paul? What does China do with all of this? What does it do next?
Okay, let me just finish up the summary of costs, and then we get to what China has to do. The cost to China of invading Taiwan anytime soon, well, I'd say anytime, are economic, political, and military. We've just mentioned the military costs because this invasion will turn into a protracted, low-intensity, irregular war. And it'll go on forever. And sure, the Chinese Communist Party had the Long March and are the product of guerrilla warfare back in the day. They haven't done that since they supported initially the Viet Cong in Indochina in the late 60s and early 70s. So we don't know how well they'll do with their own version of counterinsurgency. But also this, it would be in the Chinese interest, perhaps aided and abetted by the United States, to mine the straits and all the sea lanes leading to China. Just lay down minefields right, left, and center that the Americans, very good, yeah, that the Americans went on. Now look where Taiwan is. Think if
for those that listen to the podcast, we're looking at a map here of the various interests and territorial claims that China and Vietnam, that the Philippines, Brunei, Taiwan itself, and Japan to the north have as far as territorial claim. And Paul's speaking to those points.
Right. So one of the things the Taiwanese could do, especially if they have the aid and assistance of other powers, is to lay down minefields on the approaches to Chinese ports. And again, raise the cost to the Chinese of prosecuting the invasion of Taiwan itself. Because if you lay down these minefields, then the People's Liberation Army Navy will have to expend a lot of resources trying to clear those minefields. And that diverts resources from the invasion proper.
Because
Moreover,
if a decision was made on that, they've got to get into those territories in the first instance. If you look on the maps with respect to the territorial claims, China's defending itself in those areas very, very, very persuasively and strongly, isn't it?
Yeah. I just think that, the military costs of trying to defend against the Taiwanese defense, if you will. So there'll be high costs in invasion proper. But the cost, if the response includes mining campaigns against shipping headed towards China, again, economic lifeline, then not only are you raising the military costs to the Chinese Navy to clear those mines, but you're raising the economic costs, because so long as that conflict endures, economic production in China, it won't come to a standstill, but it's going to slow down even further. And remember, they're suffering slowdowns now. And then there's the political costs. The political costs are not what's happening abroad. The political costs will be to the Chinese Communist Party and President Xi.
How does that play out?
Well, think about it. If he goes and orders an invasion of Taiwan, and he gets bogged down in an endless war, we've heard that phrase a lot, when it comes to the Americans. But if he gets bogged down, if it turns out Chinese ports are subject to mining campaigns and goods and raw materials are not getting through, and the Chinese economy starts to stagnate so long as this conflict continues, he may be forced, he being President Xi, may be forced to sue for peace, a peace that he had until he invaded. Now, there are people with long knives in the Chinese Communist Party who are not necessarily friends of President Xi. You don't get to the upper echelons of that party by being nice. And so if he falters, if he miscalculates with a move against Taiwan prematurely, and then he simply miscalculates or misestimates.
And it escalates beyond control. For example,
well, I don't think it'll get to nuclear weapons. I mean, it may.
No,
be,
but I'm talking. Just with respect to escalation, what I was talking about in specific terms was, rogue states like North Korea seize their opportunity to be around the big deal. We've seen a lot of retaliatory saber rattling coming from North Korea in recent months, and it seems to have been intensifying, and perhaps in their way of thinking, they want to test the new administration, the Biden administration itself in such ways. But so that, I suppose, would be the fear of many, wouldn't it? That if diplomacy, which is the preferred option clearly of Taiwan at this juncture, is not successful in it being assured of its own independent governance. And then if what we're talking about, a military intervention from the point of view of containment, starts to occur, and we've talked about AUKUS in its infancy, but certainly that the Quad in the region is active, coming into the theatre there. And then you're talking about this tactic of containment through mining, then escalation would be the fear of probably China itself, but also other countries on the Western leaning support chain, if you like, or alliances or declarations. Certainly New Zealand's considerations would be one of independence as much as it can, but thinking this is the worst case scenario. So we're getting to that point, and you're unpicking those options from the point of view of China and how China would react. So how do you stop that kind of escalation in both a coalition of the willing from China's point of view of coming into play?
Well, I like your lateral thinking on this, because the behavior of other players is going to be, that's going to be the odd factor. Japan has said that it will come to the defense of Taiwan. And that's a signal to the United States that the Japanese, for the Japanese' own self-serving purposes, they're not entirely sure that the United States will do what it's committed to do. That it may offer indirect assistance. Again, it may help with a mining campaign. But when the Japanese say anything vis-a-vis all things Chinese and Korean, that's a red flag, right? That's a red flag. So the Chinese have said that. You mentioned North Korea. There we go. Now we're talking about the real, odd factor. It could be that the North Koreans would certainly come in on the Chinese side, and they'll try to stir the pot, but that obviously will bring the South Koreans into the fray. And at that point, we have to address the possibility of nuclear warfare. Even if it's tactical, once the North Koreans get involved, their logics are not entirely the logics of everybody else. I'm not entirely sure the Chinese would welcome the North Koreans getting involved, quite frankly. I think that the Chinese recognize the dangers posed by the DMK.
And we've seen that in recent weeks. Comments by Chinese diplomats and foreign ministry teams, and when they've been present down in South Korea, actually talking uneasy about North Korea's positionings and behaviours at this time. So I just wanted to inject that in there.
Yeah, no, very, very good. And let me also say, just to clear that, New Zealand's not getting involved. All right, I can guarantee you, if war breaks out, we're going to sit it out. Okay, there's no ifs and ands or buts in my mind. We will sit it out. The Australians won't, for all the reasons we've talked about in the past. But New Zealand under a Labour government, no. We're not going to touch this thing.
Even with the Washington Declaration, there's enough wiggle room and also independence in our positions in pursuit of that independent foreign policy and defence policy and the advent of AUKUS coming in, the establishment and forward momentum to that. New Zealand on respect to exercises with the Quad, be in that. But I agree with you on the issues of conflict. New Zealand will regress back into its patch and work the Pacific, the Polynesian side from its own point of view of stability and interest.
Yeah, and we'll be working the diplomatic side. I mean, let's be very clear to our friends, our hawk friends in New Zealand and beyond. The fact is that's the difference between being friends and allies. New Zealand is a friend of the United States and its other security partners, but we're not committing to alliances that draw us in to larger conflicts that may be ultimately inimical to our interests. We're a sovereign state that is recognized as such, unlike Taiwan. Again, an island state. I mean, there's a lot of lessons that our military planners might want to take from what's brewing in front of them further north. But the point is, we're not, we're friends, not allies. We're not going to get involved. We're going to play the diplomatic role. The thing here is all parties, and that includes the CCP as well as Washington, have an interest in de-escalation, backing away from the precipice, not accelerating. They're hawks, and especially media hawks, who have no skin in the game, may be beating those drums of war. But the more reasonable people, and again, you were one of them when you were talking about what Taiwan represents economically, will say, what exactly are we doing here? I mean, if we're going to run airplanes into someone else's identification zone for domestic purposes, so as to get the rest of the population to believe nationalistic fervor, as long as we all understand that's what it's about, knock yourself out. Fly airplanes all you want. If you want to show that you can stage an amphibious landing involving 3,000 troops, by the way, that's about 1/10 of what they'll need to invade Taiwan. But if you want to show you can throw 3,000 guys onto a beach, knock yourself out. Because we know what you're signaling. We know that it's not so much for us, it's for the domestic consumption. Now, if you start moving beyond that, then you get into escalation. But I just mentioned that there's many responses short of all-out war. Again, the mining campaign. When you do mining campaigns, it's very hard for the targeted country to come out and nuke you, do things like that. You're just targeting shipping to cut them off from their supplies. So you'd have to do something in kind. The response has to be commensurate because of the risk of escalation. So I think what's happening is we're approaching the point where the Chinese and the Taiwanese are going to say, let's diffuse tensions. Let's talk about what is a modus vivendi. How can we live with each other and not provoke the hawks on either side, because there are hawks in Taiwan, into aggravating the situation when the vast majority of us would benefit from going back to peaceful coexistence rather than continue the march to conflict. Maybe the Chinese want to tell the Taiwanese that they don't like the sovereign state stuff, and if the Taiwanese would agree to a two systems of government, one country policy, or if they would agree to a semi-autonomous status where their economic affairs and their military affairs remain independent, but they're considered to be a territory of the Chinese state, maybe they could work something out.
But
I happen to not think so.
Yeah, you consider the history of both those indigenous Taiwanese and also those that retreated back to there that you eloquently detailed in history. These are two different entities, aren't they, in many respects? You've got a very liberal democracy on Taiwan. You've got its significance relating to its own positions on the world and the world's answers to progress in the next 2 decades. And you've got China, who, like we've detailed in many episodes and also this one, its own pressures internally. So it does seem that perhaps the only way of establishing diplomatic common ground, considering those points, is through getting back to economic interests and common ground, and the pursuit of progress for both independently from each other, but mutually in that respect. So that might be where the leader of Taiwan is positioning and saying, you know, our desire is a diplomatic solution. But let's be clear, if we have to defend ourselves, and I've said in the past, the Taiwanese government, that will defend to the last person. Now that's pretty much drawing, and pardon the analogy, but a very deep line in the sand, isn't it?
Yeah, but let's be very clear. And I've got a thought about indigenous people I want to share with you in a second. The Hong Kong had a special financial status in Western banking systems that is now in the process of being dismantled, a special tax status, so that foreign corporations, Western corporations, could do all their banking through Hong Kong on their way in and out of the mainland. That's now being withdrawn as a result of the takeover. Taiwan could offer a similar arrangement to the Chinese and say, look, we're not as easy to take over. You need this special tax haven status for something that is Chinese territory. We can offer it to you, but we want to remain independent. Your billionaires will get to bank here and hide their money here. The Westerners can take their capital flows and channel it through us because, again, we're known for our integrity. We're known, again, we play by democratic rules of the game. That might be convincing to the Chinese. I mean, they may say, okay, we overdid it with Hong Kong, but Hong Kong is just a little city-state. Taiwan's a whole different matter. Again, its role in the global supply chain, especially when it comes to advanced electronics, is critical, absolutely critical, not just to the West, but to China itself. So there may be room for accommodation, but you're absolutely right, Selwyn. They got to get back to, again, a peaceful coexistence of sorts, because this is not good for business. Investors are sitting there waiting to see how the smoke clears on all the saber rattling. And I think, well, if you make it clear that the saber rattling had much more to do with domestic politics than international relations, then everybody can breathe a sigh of relief and go about their business. But someone's got to make a move. Now, let me say something about indigenous people. Think of it this way. Has anyone consulted the native Formosans about any of this? No, they have not. Now, Taiwan has behaved much better in the last 20 years towards its indigenous people than it did in the previous 50. That's not saying much. And you know where I see the parallels? Over the modern history of New Zealand foreign policy, how many voices, Maori voices, have we heard? Did we hear them in the 50s? Did we hear them in the 60s? Did we hear them in the 70s? The answer is no. We're hearing a little bit recently, But Mao's sons and daughters went off to fight the colonialist battles. Formosans have joined the Republic of China's armies. But nowhere are these people consulted as communities in the interplay with larger states. I mean,
so
that's
what do you think their voice would be if they were able to engage on these global issues on a world stage?
I think they'd be a significantly moderating voice for one reason, one main reason, which is they know what it's like to be oppressed. It's the voice of the subordinate. It's the voice of, the subaltern, those who are not listened to. And sometimes the argument has been made in the past with inconclusive results that the more you bring women into policy making circles, foreign policy, the less likely the chances of war. Now, the record on that is very mixed because unfortunately, foreign policy and military affairs continue to be a boys' game, a white boys' game.
We've had our exceptions with Thatcher, of course.
Yes, and Thatcher behaved like a rude man. I mean, she was not feminine in her approach.
It's a polite way of putting it.
It reminds me of discussions I had many years ago with guerrilla warfare types, which is the presence of women in guerrilla armies, let's say in Nicaragua. It made no difference. Boys or girls, you're going to have cowards and heroes. Gender, once you're under fire, it really doesn't matter. What matters is if you win the revolution, whether women will make a difference when it comes to domestic policy after the revolution. And even there, the record is mixed. But certainly, foreign policy proper. One can argue that the presence of women has at least expanded the reference points when you get into foreign policy discussions. Again, there has been movement, not necessarily always in a positive direction, but certainly the larger presence of women in politics in general and foreign policy in particular has contributed to the advancement of what used to be silent voices. Well, I would argue that the Formosans need a say here because neither the descendants of the Kuomintang regime nor the Communist Party of China are native to the island of Formosa. They're invaders. Both sides. So whether it be the PRC or the current generation of ROC leaders, they're non-native in the eyes of Formosans. And that's why I was drawing the parallel in my head about Maori who have served faithfully their colonial masters, clearly in world wars, suffered disproportionately in those wars. And yet they had nothing to do with those wars and had very little say in the prosecution of them. So I applaud the current Labor government for bringing, Maori voices to the table in our foreign policy. That's salutary. But the question is, would they change things if they did get a seat at the table? And I would argue they would, and it would not be by being more aggressive. They would be more inclined to work diplomatic channels because they know what it's like to be subordinated against their will. And so perhaps,
their experience.
They have experience with oppression, and the Formosan people in Taiwan have that experience. Excuse me.
Yeah. On that note, Paul, let's call this particular episode to a close. Thank you for your contribution and your company today, Paul, and also to those that have been watching live and also that are listening to this on demand by way of all the podcasts, wherever they wish to enjoy those. We'll be back this time next week. So in the United States, Eastern Standard Time, it would be around Wednesday evening, 6 p.m. In New Zealand, of course, it is Thursday at midday, and we look forward to your company then and your interactions at that time. Thank you again, and we look forward to being with you next week. Goodbye. Take care.